Welcome to the Alberta Prosperity Project podcast. If you're ready to listen, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Tuesday, October 4th, 2022. Welcome to episode 21 of the Alberta Prosperity Project podcast. I'm your host, Hunter, today, joined today with Tanner, who is up in Lloyd, and a very special guest from San Diego, California. We are joined today with Mr. Alex Epstein. Alex, how are you doing today?
I am good, and just in case anyone fact checks, I'm from Laguna Beach. I just have an address in San Diego to send letter bombs to.
There we go. Okay, sounds good. We got to watch out for those fact checkers, as I'm sure you know. But for those that haven't heard of Alex Epstein, he's an American author, commentator who advocates for fossil fuels. Obviously, something we're very passionate about here at the APP. He's the founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress, a for-profit organization in San Diego, California. He's currently written a number of books. Tanner, if you want to hold up a couple of them that you've got there, we have talked about them obviously on previous episodes. There's the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and his most recent book, Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. So we were so excited to be able to read through those before Alex came on the show. But yeah, getting right into the episode, I think just before we start with the fossil fuel questions, I want to get Tanner and yours as well, Alex's take on who your favorite philosopher is, and maybe if you want to go into why that question may have some significance, Tanner or Alex, go ahead.
Sure, let's hear Tanner first.
I'll start. Well, I'll be quick because everyone wants to know who Alex is. My favorite philosopher, although I'm not Catholic, is probably Aquinas. I quite like reading Aquinas. I also love reading William Lane Craig, but my favorite author philosopher would be Chesterton. I just love Chesterton. Love to read him. I think his thoughts are profound. But Alex, if you want to tell everyone, a little bit about your background and who your favorite philosopher is.
So we have a little bit of overlap because some Aristotelian tradition with Aquinas, but I like Ayn Rand, whom I consider the modern sort of embodiment of Aristotelianism. And I started reading her when I was 18, and I really thought that she was on a different level than other philosophers and other thinkers. And I think I think often she gets dismissed by people who don't understand her views. And I feel like it's just been a huge competitive advantage for me to really have studied her very early on and hopefully internalized a lot of her good thinking methods.
Oh, beauty. Well, then, having that out of the way, if our audience wants to, they can all go online. Alex is prevalent online. You can see his history, what he's been up to, his background, his education background, et cetera, et cetera. But because we have
go to my website, by the way, alexepstein.com, not Wikipedia. Wikipedia is unbelievably bad. It's amazing to see how it devolves over the years. Because they have no content about my ideas. They take all of that away. Any praise of my work, that gets taken away. And last time I checked, their number one thing is to have false accusations that I've refuted. And then they'll just have them there and they'll say, Alex disputes this, as if it's like a question of whether it's true. So it's really, there's this idea I talk about in Fossil Future, which I got from Michael Crichton. It's called the Murray-Gell-Mann effect. And it's basically after this physicist who said, every time I read about physics in the newspaper, I think the newspaper is trash. But then I read about Israel and Palestine and I think, oh, I'm sure it's accurate about that. And you realize, no, it's not accurate about anything. Mm-hmm. And so Wikipedia is a perfect, at least anything controversial, I should say. I think Wikipedia is pretty good if you're not controversial, but anything that's controversial or political, you can count on Wikipedia to take a certain view. So if you go to Wikipedia, you learn nothing about my views.
Right. Well, excellent to know. We totally agree. And at APP, we're always dealing with the same thing with fact checkers and views that are misrepresented to form these straw mans, But anyways, right into the questions. So I'm holding a book here. It's phenomenal. It's called Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil and Gas and Not Less. And even though
coal,
Alex,
it has
of course,
coal
isn't,
in it.
There it is. But this is not a paid advertisement. I think it's just that good of a book. But in it, would you be able to describe the main thesis in this book that you present? I know you mentioned terms like anti-human, anti-impact, right? Human flourishing. Could you maybe describe those for our audience?
Sure, particularly because you raised those terms. In a sense, you can divide it into its methodology and then its conclusions. And there's a lot of focus on methodology. It's really the first quarter of the book, and it's called Framework. So think of a framework as a starting structure. So just like a building has a starting structure that influences everything about the building, so your thinking has a starting structure that influences everything about your thinking. This is at the root what philosophy does, is it provides the framework for your thinking. And what I argue is that our leading institutions that are responsible for giving us expert knowledge and guidance, and I call this our knowledge system because calling it the media is a little bit superficial. I argue that our knowledge system is demonstrably a failure at evaluating fossil fuels. And I say demonstrably because it clearly does two things that make no sense. Most obviously, it ignores the enormous benefits of fossil fuels, and I would argue that's gotten us into an energy crisis, trying to get rid of fossil fuels, but not thinking about the benefits. Then the other thing which requires a little more evidence, which I discuss in chapter 2, is it consistently, what I call catastrophizes the side effects. So you have false prediction after false prediction that X side effect or effect of fossil fuel use is going to ruin the world. So we're going to run out of fossil fuels, then we're going to have too many of them, so there's too much pollution, or there's going to be catastrophic global cooling or catastrophic global warming. And the idea is always that there's some side effect or effect of fossil fuels that's going to be really bad, and very crucially, we won't have any ability to mitigate it or deal with it. And what I show is that actually the science of these side effects is always very overstated in the negative way. But even most egregiously, we ignore our ability to use fossil fuels to cope with the side effects or even to improve that area. So I mentioned with climate, we hear exaggerations about the negative impacts on climate, but even more important, we ignore all the ways in which fossil fuels make us far safer from climate, to the point that we're 1/50th as likely to die from a climate-related disaster than we were 100 years ago. So what I'm showing mainly in that first section, so I give some evidence, but the main thing is to show the institutions we are trusting cannot be trusted because they're making this basic error. And then there's a question of why are they making the error? Because it's kind of a third grade error to, like, if you were evaluating a prescription drug, would you ignore the benefits? Would you catastrophize the side effects? Not unless you had either you're ignorant, but the smartest people aren't ignorant, or you had a certain kind of motive or certain like false beliefs that you weren't willing to question. In my case, I think there's a false belief, which I call the delicate nurturer assumption, which is that Earth exists in a delicate nurturing balance that human beings will catastrophically ruin if we impact it. And that's why we keep expecting catastrophe. And then the other thing I talk about is in terms of motive, that the reason our leaders ignore the benefits of fossil fuels, but also of nuclear power and also of energy more broadly, is that they're really not focused, they're not really measuring benefit by benefit to human, what I call human flourishing on Earth, our ability to live, to our highest potential. They're really evaluating the Earth by, what I call eliminating human impact. So the goal they're operating on is we should have as little impact as possible. And so from that perspective, you don't care about benefits to humans. And in fact, benefits to humans are bad, quote, for the Earth. And this is, for example, why during the pandemic, you had all these people saying, oh, it's so amazing for the Earth, right? That everyone is suffering and dying. It's so amazing for the Earth because we're not doing anything. And from my perspective, that shows you're looking at the Earth from an anti-human perspective, from this goal or standard of eliminating human impact versus advancing human flourishing. And so that's all just the methodology. But then my main point is once you are looking at the world from a pro-human perspective, you're looking carefully at benefits and side effects, it's obvious that the benefits of fossil fuels outweigh the negative side effects. And I spend, 300 pages just documenting the obvious because most people don't know any facts. But it's really, once you're looking at it from a pro-human perspective, it is very obvious. And it's obvious we don't face climate apocalypse. So that's my main thing, is the methodology and the underlying framework are wrong. And if you have those right, then it's a pretty easy thing to think about.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great segue into the next question that we've got for you, Alex. And I really appreciated your take on that pro-human stance. But with that, I guess, how did you come to the conclusion that that is the appropriate way to kind of measure the way that we should look at the world and how we should look at fossil fuels? Oftentimes, especially in Canada here, we hear people going, climate always has to come first. We always need to abide by that standard. But why did you choose, I guess, this very pro-human standard of life that we enjoy because of oil and gas to be your main focus in the books?
It's kind of a funny question because, you wouldn't ask a lion, why do you choose to be pro-lion? Why isn't your goal to eliminate lion impact? I mean, just think about that for a second, how anti-human it is to say our goal is to eliminate human impact. It's not a love of nature, it's a hatred of our species. right? Because it's saying the rest of it, I call it human racism, because it says everything the human race impacts is bad, everything the rest of nature impacts is good. So my view is actually that this idea of eliminating human impact is kind of an insane standard, and it's certainly something that no one would embrace, almost no one, I should say, if they fully understood its implications. So my argument, and I talk about this a lot in chapter 3, is the way that this gets put forward as an idea that we should eliminate human impact is based on disguise. And so one disguise is this delicate nurture idea, where if you think the earth exists in this delicate nurturing balance, you think, oh, if we don't impact the earth and we get rid of our impact, it's going to take care of us and it'll be nice. I was like, I mean, this is a really dumb view, right? You look at history, the earth did not take care of us. But nevertheless, this is the view that people have accepted under the banner of science. But then the other thing that they do, so one is they lead us to expect that eliminating our impact will make our lives good because the earth will provide for us and it'll prevent catastrophe. But then the other thing is they disguise what it means to eliminate human impact. And what they do is they bundle together pro-human impacts that we want to get rid of or minimize with anti-human. So for example, they'll say, oh, let's protect the environment. Let's save the planet. And you think, oh, that means we have clean air and clean water. I want clean air and clean water. But then they package that with, let's shut down factories, let's shut down roads, let's get rid of fossil fuels and we have no replacement. So this is an Ayn Rand idea, actually. She calls it the intellectual package deal, where you're taking together two things that don't belong. So this idea that we should minimize anti-human impacts and we should minimize pro-human impacts, and they're all under minimize or eliminate impact. So people think that when they're quote saving the planet, they think if they're saving it for us instead of from us. But the core of it is from us. And that's why I talk a lot about not saving the planet, but improving the planet or improving our world. And that then you get, yes, we want to minimize pollution, but we want to maximize productivity. And those things need to be done in harmony. It's not that you want to minimize pollution and to minimize productivity, because one of those can be pro-human and the second is totally anti-human. So I think once you clarify that, and you clarify I'm thinking about this in the long term, I think very few people will say, yeah, I actually want as many humans to die as possible. That's my goal.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I like that line example. I might steal that. I'll give you a royalty every time.
Okay, great. I'm sure you're going to get a fortune.
Every time I say, yeah, why don't you ask a lion why he wants to act and survive as a lion? It's a good question. Now, so you're coming to Alberta. We're so excited to have you join us in Calgary, which we'll talk about at the end. But in Alberta here, and I you'd be surprised at how little the news covers this and how actually, I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, actually, we wouldn't be surprised. But at any rate, the news, the mainstream media is so hush about the reality that here in Alberta, in this province alone, we have some of the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. We're top 3 or top 4, depending on almost what study you look at in the year and so on. But at any rate, we're for sure in the top 4 throughout the whole world of proven oil reserves. Now, most of our oil, as our audience might or might not know, is heavy oil. It's a heavy sour oil, which needs a lot of refining and is this thick material. And so what's happened is, because we required oil sands and so on to actually mine that oil, it has been subject, our oil sands, our harvest of oil here in Alberta, has been subject to the ire of radical environmentalist groups and celebrities and all of these groups in North America and perhaps around the world that are commenting right on the fact that apparently this process is harming our planet, it's killing our planet, it's bad for our planet, and it's immoral, and all of these slanders are hurled against Alberta and Albertans as a consequence of our harvest of oil and gas. So could you comment on the veracity of those claims? What's your response? And even in a broader context, what's your response to those who say, well, if you drill for oil, if you use oil, you're killing the planet, you're killing the earth? What does the science say, and what does your philosophy say about that?
Let me talk first about Alberta being singled out, because there's a tendency of people to believe that, oh, I'm just against Albertan oil. But then think about in the U.S. what we have, right? We have an opposition to what they call fracking, more broadly shale energy technology. And, that's a light crude. And yet they find a way to oppose that. And then they find a way to oppose getting natural gas using that process. And they're not too focused on, say, Venezuela, like heavy crude from Venezuela, even, all of the issues involved with that, all of the inefficiencies involved with that. They're not even too focused on the Middle East these days and the issues involved there. So what's going on is it's not about those aspects of the issue. So you can talk about it and you can refute certain claims about it. But to the second part of your question, it's really about an opposition to fossil fuels. Like that's the focus. And these other issues are, it's not as if, if it were only light oil, they would love it and they would embrace it. And the basic, you can make different arguments for different fossil fuels at the margins. But the basic idea is this is providing the desperately needed, low-cost, reliable energy that billions rely on to be productive and prosperous, and that many billions more need to be productive and prosperous, and that the value of low-cost, reliable energy is so much more significant than any adverse climate impacts. I mean, if you look at climate, as I said before, we're far safer from climate than ever. The thing that determines the livability of the climate, above all, is how good are we at mastering climate. Specifically, how good are we at protecting ourselves from all the dangers that climate always throws at us, storms and floods and heat and cold. And if you have an ability to use energy and machines to neutralize climate danger, then you can do that even if climate conditions become somewhat more adverse. But if you don't have that, then any climate is a murderous climate. And this is what we've found throughout history. So it's not a serious interest in the livability of the climate, and let alone livability of the world, because you can only, climate is only one aspect of life. Like really even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, like climate livability wasn't a top priority for people, even though mostly because we had dealt with it. It used to be a top priority. The world used to be in a climate crisis before we had modern climate mastery. But you have to think about any side effect in the context of all the benefits, and even just the climate benefits of fossil fuels are far greater than the negatives, let alone all the other benefits. I think that's, if you have to, at the core, argue for fossil fuels. And then an aspect of that is, you can argue specifically for Canada. And I would argue, and against those fallacies, but I'd argue specifically with Canada. I mean, right now, more than ever, it just demonstrates how idiotic the policy in Canada has been and how idiotic the hostility has been, because the world desperately wants more oil. And Canada, is an amazing source of it. And, one of the nice things about those oil sands is they're pretty damn accessible. And I think of it actually as that we're cleaning up nature, right? I mean, it's the oil sands are just a giant natural oil spill, and we're turning that dirty oil spill into life-giving energy. Not, we as in you guys. The human race.
Absolutely. I appreciated that answer. And Tanner's an economist, so I'm sure he also appreciated that answer with the disastrous policies that we've seen in Canada. But another, we'll talk now a little bit about Europe, if that's okay with you. And it seems that they're speeding towards this energy crisis, and perhaps they actually already have one. I know that in your book you have a section where you describe how cheap solar and wind energy can lead to these higher energy prices. So can you maybe explain just a little bit why Europe is preparing for what they are going to call a cold and dark winter, and maybe does it have to do with their transition to green energy, if you want to call it that?
Sure. When we see something like this, we need to be embarrassed as a species. I really want to highlight this. And I mentioned Ayn Rand earlier and how much I love her work. And in particular, she has a novel called Atlas Shrugged that is a very philosophical novel. I don't know if you guys haven't read it, you should. But one thing that strikes me all the time when I hear this thing about being afraid of the cold is that book came out in 1957. And at the beginning of part 2 in that book, and that book is about a world in decline, in 1957, they're talking about how people didn't used to have to worry about winter. And then in the book, because of the bad policies, winter is bad. But this is 1957. They're saying we used to not have to worry about winter. And we're in goddamn 2022. And Europe is worried about winter. Like, all you need to do is burn something to keep warm, and we have an unlimited supply of burnable stuff. It's so obviously caused by policy, and we need to not normalize this impotence. Really, it's a policy of economic and climate impotence that it has been. And then if you look at what's the relationship with green energy, it's pretty obvious. The main thing is that green energy policy is always coupled with reducing the supply of fossil fuels and and therefore increasing their cost. So when people think of green energy, it's partially you're subsidizing these solar panels and wind turbines, and that's bad. And it's expensive because they're unreliable. So you basically have to pay for a reliable grid and an unreliable grid, and that adds cost. But the main thing that is happening is you're reducing the supply of fossil fuels. You have this promise, the false promise, oh, we're going to replace them with solar and wind. So we, for instance, Germany, we can restrict our own domestic production. Everyone in Europe almost can ban fracking. We can take no precautions to import, say, natural gas from the US. We can be dependent on Russia because it's all going to disappear soon because we have this green revolution. So really what they did is they artificially restricted their access to fossil fuel. And really the whole world did this on the false promise that unreliable solar and wind would replace it. And this is in a world where far more people need energy. I mean, 6 billion people use an amount of energy that we in the wealthy world would consider unacceptable. And so what you have is you have rising demand for fossil fuel, but then you're restricting your supply. And so that leads to higher prices. And in particular, in their case, it's dependence on hostile powers. So I really hope this gets through to people in America and certainly in Canada. I mean, Canada is even worse, unfortunately, than the US. And I love Canada, and I've been involved in these battles for a while in Canada. I first went up there in 2013 talking about these things. And it might be the most deliberate act of energy sabotage in the world, because if you take Europe banning fracking, that's at least more prospective. Like, they preemptively banned it, which is terrible and anti-technology. But you guys know you just have this abundance of resource, and that the number one thing you need is the ability to transport it. And you have just systemically opposed the ability to transport it and bring it to market, and ruined most of the oil industry there for no reason at all, except for the symbolism and status of people who can say, I did something to restrict fossil fuels, even though it doesn't even affect global fossil fuel use.
Right. Oh, precisely. Hunter, I like Alex. He's speaking our, because you're exactly right. We shake our heads at the complete and absolute, clear and present, deliberate, you're exactly correct, push to totally lock in our energy. It's embarrassing how we're not able to transport our oil and other forms of energy at the capacity that we should be, because we have a politicized system where a few select individuals who rely on votes from other individuals who don't champion oil and gas or recognize the benefits of oil and gas, at least explicitly, work to determine the fate of the rest of the country. I know how democracy works, but still, it's really unbelievable. Now, with perhaps our last question, just because we're running short on time, I was reading this book. As I was reading this book, one of my favorite sections so far was your section on carbon footprints, and how, if I go purchase a product from a company, I see more and more that, at the bottom of the bag or on the receipt or, on the product itself, there's a little saying or quote that says, we offset our carbon footprint, or our company is carbon neutral. And as I was reading, I was taken by your discussion on those topics. So maybe for our audience, could you describe your thoughts on those quotes themselves? Is it true that companies' carbon footprints are quote unquote offset? I know you talk about Apple in your book, but yeah, if you could give just a brief discussion on that.
One thing I find amusing about this that I just think the general public should be suspicious of is all these companies are doing the exact same things in terms of what they're producing and their output, and leaving aside inflation, their pricing. And yet they've all suddenly become carbon neutral. Like, this should be suspicious, because we're told, we need all these amazing policies. I mean, these onerous policies. And yet all the companies in the world magically just became net zero or carbon neutral. So this should be very suspicious. If that were true, it would be easy and we wouldn't need all these policies. And why restrict Canadian oil? So what's going on with these carbon neutrality claims? There's a lot of discrete fraud, which is its own subject. But the main thing that they're doing, even when they have a legitimate quote offset, is they are engaging in non-scalable offsets. And this is the thing, that every method used today of reducing significant emissions, leaving aside nuclear energy, is not scalable. So, which means, and the whole thing is the whole thing here is people are concerned about global CO2 levels and global CO2 emissions. It's a global issue. So you need to think about it globally. So to take an example, let's say that Salesforce, they claim to be net zero because they invested in some mangroves or something like that. Okay, well, leaving aside, there's probably fraud involved there. Even if they did that, there aren't enough mangrove opportunities in the world for everyone else to use. So what they're doing is they're just sort of horning in on a very limited supply of, quote, offset opportunities. One thing they often do is they take something that offsets over 30 years and they claim it for this year. So in all these ways, they're taking a fairly narrow range of assets, and then they're just hoarding them so that other people can't get them. And the analogy I think of is it would be as if getting beachfront property somehow offset your emissions. And then Bezos and Gates and all these guys say, hey, look, we just bought up all the beachfront property. We're carbon neutral. Why don't the rest of you guys copy us? And the point is there's a finite supply of these offset opportunities. And if there were an infinite supply, then by their own definition, we would have, by their own standards, we'd have no problem. So all of these things, offsets, they're not actually delivering cost-effective energy without the CO2. If you want that, the only known way that we have at scale is nuclear energy. And to do that, you need a lot of reform to liberate it. You guys actually have better policy than we do right now, but still the world needs much better policy. And I'm working on that a lot with something I call the Energy Freedom Platform, which people can follow me at energytalkingpoints.com and be on my newsletter and learn more. But anything else, all these claims about carbon neutrality, let alone 100% renewable, which that's just a lie. They just take credit for other people's renewables and give others the blame for theirs. But anything like this is evading the issue. There is no scalable substitute for fossil fuels, and there won't be for the foreseeable future. And the best hope is nuclear, and that's currently being opposed by the people who claim to care about emissions.
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun to do there, Alex. So real quick, just before we close out the show, do you mind just telling the listeners where they can find you on social media or just online, where they can get your books as well? And just some final thoughts.
Sure. So getting the book, just go to fossilfuture.com. That has a whole bunch of vendors and stuff. And students can actually, at least in the US, students can get it for free. You can try and see if you can get it in Canada as well, but that's easy there. And then I'm on Twitter at Alex Epstein, Instagram at Alex Epstein Energy, and a whole bunch of other things there. And if anyone wants to reach me directly for some reason, my email is alex@alexepstein.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, with that said, listeners, Alex will be joining us in Calgary on October 28th at the Westin. We're so excited for that. Be sure to get your tickets. The earlier bird price, is still available, only $40 Canadian, and that's going to include beef on a bun. There is going to be a cash bar as well. We're so excited to, be able to host this event and hopefully learn a lot more and not be limited to a short 30-minute conversation. But with that said, thanks so much for taking the time there, Alex, and we will talk to you later, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.